Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Teddy. It is such a pleasure to be here for a second time with the rock star conductor, Teddy Abrams. He is not, in fact, conducting rock stars. He is a conductor mostly of symphonic musicians who has the charisma and the verve of a rock star. And I'm so excited to talk to you today about your work as a composer as well and a conductor. And maybe also to sort of get into the subject of what the role of a symphony orchestra can and should be in our changing society. Because in addition to being a conductor, you are also the music director of the Louisville Orchestra, and so really integrated into a specific community at a very specific time. But Teddy comes to us this morning straight from LA, where he's been workshopping a musical that he is writing, and I just thought maybe you'd just tell us a little bit about what that is.
Yeah. There have been many layers of things going on this week, and to go from one thing to the next is always a challenge artistically, but it's one of the I think the modern challenges of musicians who are trying to do lots of things and not stick to just one straight path. And that's always been my interest in musical art, is exploring as much as possible as a creative individual and not trying to follow a single format that's expected by a label of, say, conductor or composer or instrumentalist. And one of the things that I've always felt very passionately about is composing. I would say, I don't know who's listening to this. I guess, is it going online?
I think it's being recorded, yeah.
Well, I'll just say it. But I wouldn't trust a conductor that's never composed anything. Well, I mean, it's like, I don't know what the exact equivalent is, but it's like trusting a chef that's like never, or trusting a restaurant critic that's never tried to actually make a meal. Maybe is that the equivalent? Something like that. But you know, the role of the conductor, we will obviously talk about that, is in trying to digest the material that composers have laid out, have taken the time and used their talents and their capabilities to translate their inspiration and their vision into this bizarre language of little scribbles, dots and dashes, and Italian words. And if you've never been through the process of doing that yourself, even if you don't identify as a professional composer, but if you've never been through that process of trying to translate the sounds that you hear onto a page, then I think you're not getting the full experience when you go and reverse engineer that process as a conductor, then studying what the composers did, because you're supposed to be interpreting that, if that makes sense. And I've always felt very passionately about composing because it's the ultimate exercise in exploring your own creativity. And so much of the classical music world, and some of this is just on the professional side more than the core of what we really do, but it often feels like you're in the recreation industry. You're trying to achieve a kind of perfection in recreating things that other people have idealized in some form. And over time, that's grating. It's grating on our inner sense of expression and our inner sense of creative output. And I found the ultimate kind of balm to preserve that inner creativity is composition. And I felt so passionate about that. Even when I was a little kid, I much preferred going over to the piano and making up my own music than actually doing what the piano teacher said. And I you know, it's interesting because that kind of thing is, at least when I was growing up, which was in the early 90s. I am a product of the 80s, proudly. But that was stigmatized. Like, you weren't supposed to go and improvise on the piano. You were supposed to follow the book. You weren't supposed to go and make up your own stuff and cross genres and do weird things on the piano that departed from the expectations of most of the rigorous musical training out there. And that's what I much prefer doing. And now I finally realize, we could talk about improvisation too, but the path towards composing is through an improvisatory technique. And so this is a very long way of saying what I'm doing this week is a first week of workshops on a musical about Muhammad Ali. And it's based on a piece that I wrote back in 2017, when I was in, I think it was my second year as music director of the Louisville Orchestra, I wanted to write a piece about Muhammad Ali and use his own words, because of course he was one of the great speakers, one of the most inspiring and ridiculous and funny and brilliant people when he would get up there and recite his poetry and when he would speak about the things that he was passionate about. And I wanted to use his words in a piece of music, so I wrote about a 90-minute piece about his life, and then it eventually got picked up and turned into a musical. So we're workshopping that, which is a very interesting thing to experience, because it involves a lot of people and a lot of input, and a musical is very different than a symphony, in that a symphony is your alone piece. You go up into the mountains and, like Moses, you come out, here is my piece, now we will play it. And really, nobody gets to say anything. It's really weird. Like, if you commission a piece, if I wanted to commission John Adams, like a great, famous composer, for a new symphony, he'll turn it in probably 3 years, because that's the schedule. We will start working on it on a Tuesday, and we will premiere it probably on a Thursday or Friday. There will be no workshop. There will not be input. There's not going to be discussion about, should we maybe, make that phrase a little shorter? Or how about putting that in the clarinet instead of the oboe? That will not happen. Most of other new art that's being made, film, theater, involves immense workshopping and dissection and input. And I'm experiencing that right now, which, when you're used to turning in your finished piece, means, a healthy ego check is in order. But it's very good, because conductors are famous for having overbloated egos, and so anything that puts them back on the ground is a very good thing, I think.
But so this is one of the things that seems to me like one of the interesting paradoxes of certainly the traditional view of conductors, which is that, how are we doing with my sound? Is it okay? It's that sort of, on the one hand, they're known to have big egos, and I think now some of you might have seen the movie Tar with Cate Blanchett sort of channeling, a female version of the sort of tyrannical, obsessed conductor. And there are certainly examples in real life of that. But on the other hand, we sort of think of conductors as these almost sort of transparent mediums, like these conduits that channel the intentions and the genius of the often dead composer, so that sort of genius flows through you and through your hands, and then sort of becomes manifest as music. And I would just love to hear you talk about how, well, maybe if you could remember how you sort of negotiated that relationship with the dead composer when you were younger, as a student, as a musician, and then how that maybe changed becoming a composer yourself.
And of course, growing up, most of the composers that I knew were the dead ones. I grew up and studied, the whole thing that attracted me to music was this relationship that I had with Mozart and Beethoven and Schubert. It was a pretty narrow band, actually, of music that I was exposed to by my teachers at that age, when I was starting on piano and beginning on clarinet around age 8. Piano started around 4. And nobody was telling me that there were all these wonderful living composers writing extraordinary music. That happened later. And it is weird being the odd, kind of lonely kid who really knew that he wanted to go into music. This is kind of embarrassing to admit, but I felt a very personal connection to these dead European composers that would have had nothing to do with me culturally. We wouldn't have had any basis for communicating if they happened to suddenly apparate. And it is a remarkable thing that an 8-year-old in Oakland, California, coming from my background, would feel personally connected. I really felt like these composers had more than just a musical relationship. There was like a family kind of thing that perhaps gave me a sense of belonging that I needed. It may be why psychologically I'm doing what I'm doing.
Can you give some examples of who was in that family tree of?
Well, it was very standard. It was really like Mozart, Brahms, Beethoven, Bach, and I was one of those obsessed kids. Like, I wanted to know everything about those composers. And sadly, I was also perhaps the tragic byproduct of a very rigid Western European hierarchy of art that is explicated constantly. And I'm not saying that that hierarchy doesn't have some merit in helping us identify great works, but it is very rigid and it's very specific, and any young musician who trained in that era, it's opened up a little bit, but it's still prevalent, understands and downloads this specific kind of stepped, tiered system where certain composers are just better than others. You've got Bach and Beethoven and Mozart at the very top. Like, and there's even a little tier between that group and, say, Tchaikovsky and Mussorgsky and Aaron Copland, who we all consider great. But when you're a kid, kind of indoctrinated into this system of what is best, what is right, what are standards, you're even told stuff like, we use the word standard repertoire all the time. We use the word canon all the time. I'm constantly told when I'm programming, oh, we need a big piece from the standard repertoire on the second half. What does this even mean? It's not defined well, but there is a tacit understanding that that hierarchy is very important. And a young kid growing up who might have their ears open to all the incredible music of the world, especially in a moment like this when it's available, is kind of silently being trained to think that that hierarchy is the only way to consider musical evolution or musical systems that establish what's good and what's bad. And I'm not saying that that isn't important, that there isn't the ability to judge and to say that Bach is absolutely great. But this system that gets kind of either silently or sometimes explicitly replicated of saying, actually, Bach is not just great, it's better than lots of other things, is really harmful in the end. We've all been programmed that way. We've been programmed, I mean, Bloom talks about this in literature, of course. It's, there's this anxiety of influence, right, that comes from having a canon so deeply established and replicated generation after generation. This is all to say, though, when it comes to your own creative output as a composer or as a conductor trying to do something with that music, it's really challenging when you're measuring up not only against the towering artistry of the works themselves or the thing that you're trying to accomplish, but also an entire history that's now been stamped and very firmly placed in that tiered system. It's hard to then nurture what your own voice might be. Other genres of art suffer from this too, but our brethren in the pop music world are less bound by this. There's more of an expectation in that world that each generation gets to express something new, gets to express something that isn't necessarily compared in opposition to what came before. It's allowed to be a new way of creating music each decade, each moment. And we've really struggled with that in our world. It's one of the reasons why there's this, I think, powerful bias against what people would consider new music, even though that means absolutely nothing. It means absolutely nothing because there are bristling avant-garde pieces from 100 years ago. And there are pieces written yesterday that are the most exquisitely tonal, melodic pieces that would melt your hearts if you heard them. But again, we've downloaded so many stereotypes and rigorous systems for thinking and processing what's good, what we want to hear, what our tastes should and ought to be.
I mean, to me, that's fascinating because in my own concert series, Beginner's Ear, I deliberately don't offer a program because if people see the date of a composer or the name, like the sort of something already comes in to judge and to bring in expectations of what they're about to hear. And I mean, that is in itself a convention too, the printed program, the subscription series. And I mean, I'd love to hear from you how you in Louisville are sort of, what are you able to change about the conventions of a classical music concert series? What is inherently unchangeable because it sort of comes with the territory?
Yeah, well, it's such a good question because you're not only answering to the musical sensibilities of the people in charge, and that could be me, it could be the board, it could be the executive director, but it's also the musicians and their capabilities because we have certain schedules that we follow, and the schedules that we've set up for all modern symphony orchestras are designed to process music that's quite familiar already very quickly. We've set up a schedule where we're designed to take a Beethoven symphony, start it on Tuesday, and get it out to a performance by Thursday. It's not designed to absorb complex new music that takes up a lot of real estate on the program, which is why when you see a lot of concerts that have a new piece, it's usually the 5-minute opener. Maybe it's a 20-minute concerto, but it's simply because the system isn't really set up to digest that music. It's also the audiences, because there is something unbelievably powerful about seeing something that you know. I respect that 100%. It's why when you go to the theater and you see Romeo and Juliet and you studied that as a kid and maybe you acted it in community theater and you know the lines and then you go see an incredible production of Romeo and Juliet, it does something cathartic. I recognize that in the same way that when you see the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven, everyone knows the Ode to Joy. They don't know the first 3 movements usually, but when they get to the Ode to Joy, however many minutes into the last movement, something happens to that entire audience. Same thing that happens at the beginning of Carmina Burana. Those moments are really special. However, those pieces were all born out of a culture that allowed them to exist. They once were world premieres. They once were unfamiliar pieces. Audiences once had to listen to ta-ka-ta-dum and go, what is that? That's not a melody. I can't even tell where the beat is. I defy you to tell me where the beat is. Actually, if you haven't ever read it, it's probably not what you think. It's not 1, 2, 3, 4. It's actually 2, 3, 4, 1. All right, you can go and tell that to your friends as trivia. But those pieces were allowed to exist because the culture around them offered a platform for new art on a regular basis that wasn't so tied to judgment prior to listening. And Louisville is a really interesting place, or Louisville for those that know better. Anyway, the Louisville Orchestra was founded right after a giant flood in 1937 by a very charismatic mayor. And this mayor, named Charles Farnsley, was obsessed with turning Louisville into ancient Athens. Like, he had this idea that it would be either like it would be the city where the art flowed through the streets and the theater was the venue where all people, all citizens of Louisville came together to discuss and contend with the issues of their time. And he was not only this classicist in a certain way, but he was also a very progressive mayor. And he had this idea. He said, well, this is so crazy that this happened from a government perspective. But he was looking around and saying, how could we have something artistically that defied all the expectations? How could we, if we're going to have an orchestra, which is what he wanted to do, what would this orchestra be that didn't look like any other orchestra? So he got this idea that the Louisville Orchestra would be the most important commissioning orchestra in the world. And he convinced the Rockefeller Foundation to give the Louisville Orchestra, which was basically a community orchestra, like they could hardly get through regular old repertoire, to give them the equivalent of $5 million, which was, it was 100 times the year's budget preceding that, to commission, record, and perform multiple times new music on a regular basis. They ended up making 160 albums of commissions from huge names, Villalobos, Aaron Copland. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Big names, and also some that are sadly forgotten. Fascinating composers that they found in South America, people who'd escaped the Nazis and moved to America with nothing, who'd been big names in Europe before. And they commissioned more music than any other orchestra by almost a full order of magnitude. The next most invested orchestra at that moment was the Boston Symphony, because they had they have a wonderful summer festival called Tanglewood, which is kind of a haven for composers. And the Louisville Orchestra was commissioning 10 times as many pieces as the Boston Symphony in tiny little Louisville. And in this, I tell you the story because it's such a beautiful image for what American cities can do and can be. I had a moment there where I grew up in San Francisco, and my teacher growing up was Michael Tilson Thomas, the music director of the San Francisco Symphony, and he's like a parent to me. We're very, very close, and I still am very close and was throughout my whole education. And I had a moment where I brought him out to the Louisville Orchestra as a special guest, and I was doing some of his music on the program, then he was going to conduct the orchestra on the second half. And that's a really big deal, because he really only conducts the LA Phil, the Chicago Symphony, the London Symphony, the New York Philharmonic, and the Philly Orchestra, and the San Francisco Symphony. That's really it. So for the Louisville Orchestra to have this opportunity is very special. And I'll never forget when I brought him out to introduce him to the orchestra. First of all, the orchestra sat in complete silence, which never happened. They're normally hacking away, tuning, and everyone was dead silent for 10 minutes before the rehearsal started, just sitting there. And I brought out MTT, as he's called, Michael Tilson Thomas. And his first greeting to the orchestra said, "Good morning to all my friends in the Louisville Orchestra. I have to tell you that I grew up listening to your records because it was the only way to hear this music that you had commissioned, and it inspired me to go on to be a composer and a musician myself, so it is very meaningful for me to be here with you all today." And you can imagine, us here, we know we're in Kentucky, we have a certain humility about that. We know what that means to have one of the most important conductors who's ever lived saying what an honor it is to be standing here because this orchestra meant something to him. That's a demonstration of what cities like Louisville can do. They can be transformative and adventurous and lead the way. We don't need to wait for the coast to decide, what the standards and the expectations are. That's one of the reasons why I love working in Louisville, because it can matter. What you do actually can really matter to people there. And I know this is a long way from the original question, but what we've tried to do now is create the same basic inspiration for that plan back in the 1940s, this plan to be the center of new music, but do it in a way that makes more sense for the 21st century. And one of the answers that we came up with, which was born out of the pandemic, was saying Louisville has suffered a lot in the pandemic era, not only obviously in the same way that all cities did, but with the Breonna Taylor issue that happened right there, that the city was really torn apart in so many ways, and it felt very fractured. I've always suggested that artists are some of the most capable people in healing. Not necessarily because they just paint, a nice mural and everybody feels good, but they're the best people to hold up mirrors and say, here's a reflection of who we are, but also say, here is a dream of what we could be. If you have a city without artists like that, it's soulless. And I thought, what an amazing opportunity to attract those people to Louisville at this moment, saying our city has been through the ringer, we have had our challenges, but if we're to be better and we're to find ways of connecting and caring about each other, which is severely lacking in society today, you need to attract artists there because they start that process and they inspire others to do it. So we created a program where the orchestra now has 3 full-time composers working for us. They're not being commissioned. They are full-time staff members of the Louisville Orchestra as composers. This hasn't happened in the musical world really since, Haydn worked for the Esterházy family, since, Bach would have been employed by a church in Leipzig, the Thomaskirche. It hasn't happened in America. We've given up on that model because we've put conductors and soloists at the top of the heap. Composers, they get the worst deal, absolute worst deal. They're the ones writing the music that's supposed to express our life and times. Why are we giving them the worst possible circumstances and no agency? So we said, what would it look like if those composers were given a seat at the table for how the orchestra proceeds, how we make decisions about art, and we put their art on a regular basis out for the audience so that the audience care about those specific composers. They're not just random names that you've never heard of before and world premiere by so-and-so you're never going to see again. It's the same people that you're getting to know on a personal basis. So sorry for the soapbox tirade right there.
I'm so glad because I wanted you to speak about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it does lead into a question that I did want to also bring up, which relates also to social divisions and heartache in this country and in the cities and the limits of art to speak for everyone. To what extent do you think an institution like a symphony orchestra can be relevant to all constituencies in a city? What would that look like? Is it a matter of how important is representation, for example, and identity in the classical concert hall? And maybe do you see correlations between programming choices and who comes into the hall, or is it about the artists who perform and the audiences that they bring in?
Yeah, it's such a tough question. I mean, in some ways, I wish that orchestras would be more honest with themselves. And if an orchestra wants to present music from a certain era and a certain format, then just say that. Just like if you're the Asian Art Museum or you're the Neue Gallery and you're really focused on a specific era of art, own that, be that. But we have a real issue because when you take the city's name in your organization, you are the Louisville Orchestra, you are, well, maybe not the city, but the Metropolitan Museum of Art. We know which metropolitan we're talking about. You've just given yourself a big responsibility. If I said that we were going to be the classical orchestra of Louisville or the romantic era orchestra of Rancho Mirage, we would be saying here's the box as artists that we want to live in. We love this repertoire, we love this art, and we are going to specialize in presenting that. I actually think that's really valid. It's really valid to say that's what I care about. There's nothing wrong with that, and then you're free of a lot of other responsibilities. However, if you're going to take the city's name in your organization and you're going to accept money from people with the social contract that you are providing a service to that community. And by the way, we need to establish that most people that give today, especially in communities like Louisville, are not giving because they want to see one piece of music played. We don't have donors that say, I love the Mahler 8th Symphony. I'll give you $100,000 to put on Mahler 8th Symphony. That's just not something that happens in Louisville, and it doesn't happen in 95% of American communities. There are still a few places where there are people that will want to see one, piece or one project happen. Most of the people that give generously to the Louisville Orchestra, whether they're foundations, individuals, corporations, are doing it because what we tell them we're going to do is help the community be better. And I don't want to sound like, Facebook in 2010. I don't want a Zuckerberg vibe of, we just make everybody more connected and the world's better, because clearly that didn't work. So I'm very cautious of delusions of grandeur here. But when I talk about why the orchestra is important, and I'm talking to a person that can give their money to a medical cause, can give their money to an educational cause, or can give their money to the arts, I am trying to express a vision where the orchestra matters in our community right there, our neighborhoods, because it does something that's an essential public function. Interestingly enough, that's much more connected to the way people would have thought about orchestras and music making in general 200 years ago. It wasn't superfluous, it was necessary. It was part of the act of social cohesion, whether it was parlor concerts presented by Schubert, that were a means for relatively starving artists to get together and share and find communion, or Bach's work in Leipzig. We're talking about establishing art as a centerpiece, as a pillar, and a unifying agent in community. So that actually represents the values, and that represents the model that I'm trying to express, which leads to then the question, if you call yourself the Louisville Orchestra or the New York Philharmonic, then you better serve everybody in that community. And that means a variety of things for me. One, it means absolutely not abandoning the idea that a lot of the music that we play is tremendous. That I think there is a universal element to the greatest symphonies of Beethoven and Mahler. There is a universal element to Leonard Bernstein's greatest scores. And there is a tremendous universal element to hearing Carmina Burana. So everybody deserves that. But also, the orchestra needs to be more than just a series of good concerts. And that's a big shift. I talk about the Louisville Orchestra as an essential public service, which means the concerts are a part of, or a byproduct of, serving that core function and that mission, which is to be a platform for music making to somehow express itself in our community that is very meaningful to its citizens. And that means, yes, having central convening powers of saying this big concert hall downtown is a place where we want to gather and celebrate in an almost ritualistic way the great repertoire of the present and the past. But it also means saying that many people don't go to that place, either because they don't like it or they don't feel comfortable there, they don't feel ownership over that experience. So as musicians, you'd think with the resources of an orchestra, having 60 full-time instrumentalists and 3 full-time composers and 1 of whatever I am, we should be out meeting people, forging relationships. And this gets to the deeper question. The reason why a lot of times orchestras aren't relevant in society is simply because of a lack of a personal relationship to this music or to the musicians. It's actually not because the music is old and stuffy anymore. That's ridiculous. I mean, when people go and see a movie with a great score by John Williams, his music is based on the same language as Stravinsky and Prokofiev and Shostakovich, right? And nobody's saying, that stuffy old music doesn't belong in this movie. People listen to it and think it's amazing. So clearly we don't have a stylistic problem so much as we have a relational problem. And some of it's simulated and some of it's real. People go and see Taylor Swift not only because there's an immense social power behind her output and her music making, but it's also because people who are fans of hers feel personally connected. They feel like they know her. They feel like they have a place in her community that she's built. Frankly, Taylor Swift's done a hell of a better job at doing that than most orchestras, who have essentially said, the music is great. The music speaks for itself, like an eel in some coral waiting for the fish to just come to it. And that's a terrible model. That's not a model of ambassadorship, like waiting for things and just hoping they happen to stumble in. That's not serving everybody. Serving everybody means meeting people. I'll never forget this Leonard Bernstein anecdote where he was talking to the composer Ned Rorem, and this confused me for a very long time until I got my job as music director. Apparently Bernstein said something like, "Oh, I just wish that everybody would love my music. I just wish that I could get to know everybody. Why can't I meet everyone?" I always thought, those three things seem different. Like, what do you mean you want everybody to like your music, but you also want to get to know everybody, you want to meet everyone? And I realized what he was saying is that when, like a politician, when you go and shake a hand and you say, "Can I tell you why this music is so meaningful to me and why it changed my life?" that person on the other side of that, who might never have heard it before, has a very different experience than if they just get a flyer or see a poster or see something in the paper that says, "You're playing the Mahler Second Symphony." If I shake their hand and say, "When I was 12 years old, I played the Mahler Second Symphony for the first time, and it's the moment when I had a spiritual transformation. As soon as the chorus came in at the end, and I felt like I was lifted out of my seat and had transcended time and space, and I want to recreate that for you." That's a way better framing than any of the marketing slogans we've come up with in the classical music world, which is one of just distance between people. And we've got to break that down if we're going to have a meaningful, successful, creative and cultural life, a vibrant cultural life.
I love that.
I mean, first of all, it's just incredible to hear the enthusiasm and energy with which you speak. I don't know.
Yeah, say it again.
I don't think my mic is on. I'm just going to project. So it's just so amazing to hear the enthusiasm with which you speak. And I was just wondering whether, as we near maybe question time, whether you could just talk about one concert in the last year that was really great for you and what made it great. Like, if you could just take us into the experience of a conductor having a really good performance.
Oh, that is a really good question. So the question is, could I describe a musical experience or a concert that was really meaningful in the last year, where everything went just right? So I will say, to frame that,
10 years.
in the last 10 years. So as a conductor, you're operating on multiple kind of timelines. Like, you are aware of the immediate need to provide information, visual information, rally the orchestra, get everybody playing their best, right? So you have that in mind. Then you have the phrasing structure, like, is this bar of music leading to the next bar of music in the right way? Are we phrasing and being musical in that sense? Then you have the bigger pacing issue, which is the general shape of this performance working? Like, are the contours and the proportions of the music working? And then you have the other issue, is the audience even liking this thing? Because I'm the conduit. I'm customer service right there. I can tell when they all start getting, are you serious? In Ein Heldenleben, we're going to repeat the whole thing again. I thought it was just finished. I'm the one that translates all of that. So it often is hard to fully inhabit the moment when a piece is absolutely landing, and it's hard to tell. But there have been so many incredibly meaningful performances, uh, especially born out of the pandemic. A lot of the repertoire that we've chosen, a lot of the projects um, have reflected the values of the institution in a way that are a lot cleaner and a lot clearer and more specific. I'm trying to think. Okay, I'll give you maybe two examples. But one was this new program that we just started, where the orchestra goes into parts of the community that are not used to having the orchestra at all, and they are not concert halls in the least. They don't resemble concert hall venues. One of them that we played at was a food market in Louisville. And by the way, these are not stunts. We're going to go back there 3 times every single season, and there are all kinds of community building exercises that lead up to each performance. And we played a really cool program of one of our composers, our staff composers, had a piece that was presented on this program, and the Shostakovich Ninth Symphony. And we're sitting here in this food market, and it was completely packed. It's the first time since COVID ended that I performed to a completely packed audience, even though it was a small room. But the energy was unbelievable. There was clanking when the bar was open, and people were it was casual, it was fun. But like during the Shostakovich Symphony, I felt like people were on the edge of their seats. They were also about 2 feet away from the musicians. It was vibrant, and I had this recollection of how Haydn symphonies were premiered in London in this tiny boxed room that could seat about 200 people, and apparently it was unbelievably hot because of the number of people crammed in. And I felt like this is the energy. That's what it must have felt like to hear the world premiere of a Haydn symphony. Here we are amongst people that don't come to the downtown concert hall, and everyone was so excited to be there. I felt so genuinely good about that concert. And it wasn't a perfect concert. The acoustics were super weird. There were all kinds of funky things that happened. The cocktail shaker was providing an unfortunate rhythm during the really quiet clarinet solo and the slow moment. But it didn't matter. It was like, this is what music making can be. It's like, that's what music making can and maybe should be. So that was a really special moment that we had. I think a lot of the others are just some of the more intimate moments. I will also share something during the pandemic. At the worst part of both the pandemic and the protests in Louisville, things were so fractured and disintegrating socially. I felt like I had to do something, anything really. And so I created this thing called Comfort Concerts. And on Facebook, back when I had that, I've given up. But I said, just sign up. I will do 15-minute concerts for anybody that signs up over Zoom. Like, I'll just come to you in your house, your family, whatever it is. And people from all over the world signed up for these things. I thought it would be just Louisville, but it was I thought, okay, I'll play a couple things and that will be it. They were the most intimate and moving experiences I've ever had as an artist. I would be piped into a family's living room while they'd just be cleaning up for dinner, and there'd be an infant with like spaghetti all over his face, and the mom like trying to catch him. And I got piped into a public park where a group of teens were sitting around in a circle and put the phone in the middle. I had a moment where a lady who lived in the area where a shooting that took place right after some of the protests happened had occurred, and she was all by herself. This older black lady who sang. Her favorite song was Simple Song by Leonard Bernstein from Mass. And I played the piano part, and I heard her singing back on Zoom kind of out of time, and that was the experience that we shared. And like, I would come out of these sessions, and I do like 4 or 5 hours at a time, just like emotionally wrought. It was everyone, all demographics and backgrounds. And I had thought, you know what, these are the least vaulted performances ever, but they're the most important to me. No one's gonna ever even really know these took place. No one's even seeing them except for 2 people, or sometimes just 1 person. But they were the most important thing that I think I've ever been a part of musically. So that would be probably my other answer. Yeah. Yeah.
So we have about 6 minutes time for questions. Does anybody have a question? Yes?
What instruments do you play?
What instruments do you play?
I started on piano, and then I learned clarinet, and then eventually I learned the basics of a bunch of other instruments like violin and viola. And then I took up saxophone and organ, so I do play those. But mostly piano and clarinet are the ones I'd.
And where did you go to school?
Well, I had a very, very weird education, but I went. Yeah, it's a very strange thing. If you want the whole story, I could tell you one day. But I went for 2 years to the San Francisco Conservatory of Music when I moved out from my house to there, and then left when I was 18 to go to the Curtis Institute of Music, and I did my conducting work there, which is a very small. It's in Philadelphia, a very tiny music school. It's like the Hogwarts of music schools. You would pass it and not know it's even there. It's a special place.
Yes? Where and how did you get your street cred?
My street cred? Wait, what you mean like? Oh. Oh. I don't know. I try and I think that it has to come from some of the values in my family. There is an element of humility and respect for the circumstances that you're lucky enough to have, and understanding that that's not something that everybody has, that my dad really emphasized as a kid. That was a very big deal for us growing up, like that edge of appreciating what you're lucky enough to have, and also being very aware of the world around you, and understanding that like any time you have a gift or an opportunity or a resource, you do have to share that. That was really deeply instilled. And it wasn't something that I had to be told later, which happens a lot in the classical music world, like probably maybe everywhere, but it wasn't something that people had to say, you really have to do community engagement work, you really have to care about education. I just felt that because it had been instilled. And I think that because that was a value, it meant you have to be able to talk to everybody. And you have to listen to what people say, not just wait for them to stop talking, but you also you have to listen, and you have to be able to relate to all people, if especially if you're going to do something kind of esoteric and that has become more and more pushed to the periphery of mainstream culture. If you want to draw it back in, you've got to be able to speak to any person. So that's I think my street cred. But I grew up in Oakland, California, which back in the 80s and 90s, like that, now I don't know what that means. It's pretty bougie, I think. It was not quite as bougie back then.
I'd like to hear your comments on getting kids turned on, school-age kids turned on to music, and the benefits of doing that.
Yes. Well, so the question is, how do you get young kids to be excited about music? Obviously, the very basic answer to that is any opportunity that you have for the kids to actually play music in a way that's going to make them happy is the key. The challenge is that right now, kids have more of a relationship to music in general than they ever had. And we often feel like maybe from a traditional perspective, we're always hearing, school music is not getting funded, they're not having opportunities to play, there aren't instruments for the kids. But the kids are out there making music in ways that were not even conceivable a short while ago. They're writing their own tunes. They are composing in some form using technology that allows the process to be quite democratic. And music education in general has not caught up to that, and it hasn't emphasized that the kids expressing their own creativity through music is the way in. And even for me, who had a traditional classical education, the way in was not because a teacher told me, practice this and this result will happen. It's because I liked playing my own music at the piano. That was what excited me the most. And I had just enough leeway to do it. And I feel like if music education continues to be open to that and say, look, we've got incredible technological capabilities here, write the music, play the music that you want to play. We'll couple that with the technical expertise to then help you grow. That's the path forward. But if we keep saying, actually, let's ignore all the resources that we have and say there is a specific way to educate kids musically, it's going to get harder and harder. The cost to entry will be astronomical. And of course, the benefits are equally astronomical. Let's just face it. If we were as food illiterate as we are music illiterate, I mean, like, things are bad enough, but I mean, we would really be in trouble. Like, people listen to so much music and have no idea how it works. We listen to so much music, and if you ask people to even describe the basic mechanics of it, most people would not be able to even start. You know what I mean? Like, music illiteracy, I mean, it's not really like a huge problem in the world. I think we've, but it is weird. It's really weird that we listen to that much music and don't know anything about it in general. Like, there's no, like, we know nothing of the basic grammatical system.
Yeah, so we all should be musicians, and at least the cocktail shaker can be a valid rhythmic accompaniment to Shostakovich. And this is my main takeaway.
That it is, absolutely. Yeah, try it out.
Thank you so much. We are unfortunately out of time, but
Thank you
so much.
Thank you, Corinna. Thank you. Thanks for having me.